Thank the organizers for the invitation to this fascinating conference. Edward Said argued in his foundational book, Orientalism, that colonial ideologies structured European perceptions of the so-called Orient, which really included the non-West in general. And he argued that Orientalism gave rise to actual colonial practices as well. Yet Said also called attention in this book, Orientalism, to dissident voices within the Orientalist tradition and to European defectors from the cause. Said went even further in his 2002 lecture on Freud and the non-European, where he distinguished between texts that, quote, remain inertly of their time, and texts like Freud's own, which he argued, quote, brush up unstintingly against historical constraints. In a fascinating response to Said's lecture, the British psychoanalytic feminist Jacqueline Rose argued and agreed that we should read any historical writer, quote, not just for what they failed to see, and not just for the ideological blind spots of their writing. Instead, Rose argued, we should look for the, quote, as yet unlived, still shaping history, which their vision, if only partially, tentatively, foresees and provokes, end quote. In the meantime, since the Freud lectures, movements to decolonize literary and theoretical canons have only amplified the importance of Edward Said and Jacqueline Rose's warnings from two decades and more ago. This is also true of recent analyses of European empires and European thinking about colonialism. Most of these studies foreground, for good reason, racism and violence. In my own book, The Devil's Handwriting, Des Teufels Handschrift, I focused on the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia, in German Southwest Africa. And elsewhere, I've written about the lasting effects of colonialism on poverty and segregation and underdevelopment in Africa as a result of colonialism. Yet I do think it's important, and I'm grateful to the organizers for allowing me to think about that there are always already anti-colonial thinkers in politics in Europe, as Benedikt Schuchtay argued today and in his book Die Europäische Expansion und ihre Feinde. In my current book, The Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, I find that the majority of French social scientists in all of the disciplines, in particular in sociology, who were working in the colonies after 1945 for the next 20 years, or writing about the colonies, even starting in the late 1930s, rejected colonialism. The majority were anti-colonial, and many of them, including the four that I give case studies of in my book, Pierre Bourdieu, Jacques Berck, Raymond Aron, and Georges Ballondier, all argued in differing ways that racism was at the very heart of the colonial state and regime. German thinkers played an important role in modern international anti-colonialism by developing an intellectual framework that rejected universal theories of progress, those which really informed most Western colonialisms. The first international anti-colonial organization, the Liga gegen Imperialismus, was founded in Germany in 1926, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Clearly, there never was, as Professor Schuchtay has already told us, a uniformly imperialist culture in Germany or in Europe. And German colonialism was itself heterogeneous, ranging at the one extreme from the murderous extreme of Southwest Africa to the more paternalistic forms of what I call salvage colonialism in German Samoa, to something very different in Germany's Chinese colony, Qingdao, which is the one that I'll focus on today, which evolved from something resembling apartheid into something very different during the short period from 1897 to 1914. I'm going to, in fact, focus my comments on China and on China's place within German anti-colonial practice and thinking during the Wilhelmine and the Weimar periods. And I'll focus specifically on the German missionary and founding sinologist or China specialist, Richard Wilhelm. I'll also discuss China's role within Weimar era anti-imperialist thought and agitation. But first, I want to say a few words about German anti-colonialism in general and its connections to the rest of the world. I think one of the most interesting and original formations of at least intellectual sources for anti-colonialism is rooted in German idealism, romanticism, and historicism, which we heard about this morning. One of the things that this formation has signified throughout the intellectual history of the last century and a half or 2 centuries is the singularity, individuality, and diversity of human cultures, and the plurality of developmental paths. Even if this was not fully developed by Herder and Hegel, as we've heard, this became radicalized over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, by which time historicism, or forms of neo-historicism, permeated all of the human sciences in Germany, especially and most importantly for this current discussion, those that dealt with non-Western cultures, especially ethnology. And this was crucial. One prominent example of this that I don't think has been mentioned yet today is Leo Frobenius, an ethnologist and Africanist. Frobenius condemned colonialism unambiguously and emphasized the complexity and sophistication of pre-African pre-colonial cultures. And this is the reason Frobenius's ideas were taken up by the first thinkers of the Negritude movement, Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, and also by Leo Senghor. This is how Frobenius described European colonization in 1898. Quote, "With our iron fist we crush all other peoples. We sow our colonies on the corpses of decaying races and cultures. We burn down the homes of alien developments in order to build up our palaces on the smoking funeral pyres," end quote. Frobenius's ideas were so inspirational for Suzanne Césaire that she wrote in the journal Tropique, the founding journal of Negritude during World War II, praising Frobenius's, quote, "magnificent message, his critique of the European mania for power and domination, and his rejection of the definition of civilization as progressing according to a single line from primitive barbarism to the highest modern culture." What about German perceptions of China and imperialism in East Asia? 3 contexts were especially important for this. The first was the older and very long-lasting tradition of European praise for China from the writing of the Jesuits, the Cameralists, the Physiocrats, and the Enlightenment, some Enlightenment philosophers, like Voltaire. A more hostile discourse gained traction in the late 18th and especially in the mid-19th century in the context of the Opium Wars, the annexation of European colonies along the Chinese coast, beginning with Hong Kong, and culminating in the German conquest by the German Navy of Qingdao. During its first decade, Qingdao was an archetypical colony. Legal and social relations were based explicitly on the presumed inferiority of the Chinese. Racism underwrote the dualistic legal system, the city's segregated layout, and everyday interactions on the street between Chinese and Europeans. Political control of the city of Qingdao and the surrounding countryside, even well into the Shandong province, lay in the hands of the German Navy. Nonetheless, some aspects of German policy began to move away from this starting point towards something more interestingly syncretic and open-ended. And I think this open-endedness is one of the features of anti-colonialism that we've already heard about in the years leading up to 1914. Here's a picture of Suzanne Césaire that I wanted to give you as a reference. One example is the German-Chinese University, shown here, which opened in the city of Qingdao in 1909. The initial plans for this school were geared toward enhancing German influence over China's elites. Yet the university's very constitution was also shaped by the modernizing policies at the time of the Chinese government itself. China's reforming educational program at the time was captured by the slogan, quote, "Chinese learning should remain the essence. Western learning should be used for practical development," end quote. In Qingdao's university, the mechanical arts and the natural sciences were oriented toward Western science, but the humanities were centered around a combination of Chinese and European approaches. The imperial Chinese and German dynasty flags flew in front of the building side by side. You cannot see this too well here, of the building, which is a hint at a kind of a shared sovereignty, even within something that's supposed to be a colony. Chinese students were also able to influence the university's practical activities. One example is when the Republican leader Sun Yat-sen wanted to visit the school, and the students wanted to meet with him, but the university resisted. Eventually, they succeeded in allowing him to visit the university. So this brings me to Richard Wilhelm. I want to start by reading a quote that gives you a sense of Richard Wilhelm's mature views of colonialism in the 1920s. In 1927, the journal Europäische Gespräche asked dozens of prominent Germans whether the country should become involved in colonialism again. Germany had, of course, lost its empire in World War I. Around half of the published responses rejected the idea, but primarily for pragmatic reasons. Richard Wilhelm gave a much more forcefully negative answer based on an ethical and political criticism. He argued, quote, "It had been one of the great errors of human history to think that one nation has a right to take possession of another as a colony. This error contradicts the fundamental right of every nation to its own land, and it has led to endless wars throughout history. Ethics dictate that we break with the injustices of the past," end quote. How did Wilhelm come to this, what at the time was a rather radical conclusion, at least within European thought? To understand this, I think we need to step backwards to 1899, when he first arrived in Qingdao. Wilhelm lived in China for the next 25 years, first as a missionary from a very liberal missionary society, the Weimar Mission, and then as a scientific advisor to the German legation in Beijing, and finally as a lecturer at Beijing University. In 1925, he took up a chair in Chinese history at Frankfurt am Main, and there he directed the China Institute and also created the journal Sinica. The main arena for Wilhelm's activity in Qingdao was the educational system, which is, of course, always at the heart of colonial rule. Starting in 1905, the German government opened the first of 27 Chinese grammar schools in the colony. The instructors at these schools were both German and Chinese. The Germans all came from the Weimar mission. But unlike most missionaries, they didn't try to convert anyone at all to Christianity. In fact, they rejected conversion per se. Instead, they provided secular lessons and avoided religious material. At the time, this was a very significant gesture of cultural rapprochement and recognition after the invasion of Qingdao, which was the result of the killing of 2 German missionaries and a movement that culminated in the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the century. Richard Wilhelm also created the Chinese-German Seminar in Qingdao. This was a gymnasium which trained Chinese teachers for the grammar schools. According to Wilhelm, this school was involved in what he called cultural exchange, rather than a unidirectional transfer of European knowledge, which he disapprovingly called our mechanical culture. Like the grammar schools, there was no religious instruction at all, and he condemned conversion as leading to the, quote, alienation and disenchantment of Chinese humanity. In 1911, Wilhelm created what he called the Confucius Society in Qingdao. The Confucius Society members were former Chinese officials and traditional scholars who sought exile in Qingdao, in the German colony, in the wake of the Republican Revolution and the collapse of the Qing regime. The Confucius Society's aim, according to Wilhelm, was to stimulate respectful exchange between German and Chinese culture. Wilhelm protected Chinese artifacts rather than pillaging them, and he created a so-called Chinese library in Qingdao in order to, quote, collect the treasures of Chinese literature, many of which, he added, were crudely destroyed during the storms of the Republican Revolution. What happened to German perceptions of China and imperialism during the colonial era? I want to briefly examine these issues during the Weimar Republic now, and then return to Wilhelm. Resentment about the loss of the German colonies in World War I fueled an irredentist movement in Weimar that was powerful enough to convince the Nazis to create an Office of Colonial Policy in 1934. This movement was countered, though, by pacifists and organizations of students and activists from all over the European colonial world living in Berlin and other cities at the time. And the most prominent of these anti-imperialist organizations in Germany, and indeed in Europe at the time, was the League Against Colonialism. The League Against Colonialism, or imperialism, it changed its names on and off. At its height, go back to that one. At its height, it had branches in 16 German cities, and it had 5,000 members nationwide. So there were at least 5,000 anti-imperialists in Germany in the Weimar Republic. That's good to know. More scholarly and artistic forms of anti-colonialism emerged among various intellectuals, such as the writer, the playwright Alphonse Paquet, a journalist and playwright who was active also in the Liga gegen Imperialismus, as shown here. I want to call attention to the intense focus on China within this anti-imperialist movement in Germany during the 1920s, especially on the far left and in the Communist Party. This, of course, reflected the Soviet Union's decision to turn its attention to East Asia after the failure of revolution in Europe, and also as a result of the increasing anti-imperialism and militancy in China by the alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT Party. The League Against Imperialism first emerged out of the 1925 campaign by the German communist Willy Münzenberg and his organization, the International Workers' Relief. His campaigns under the slogan, Help China, as shown here, and Hands Off China, as shown the next one, were directed against Western imperialism, primarily British, within China. The League held its first Congress in Brussels in 1927, February of 27. And at the Brussels conference, the Chinese delegation was second in size only to the German one. China was the first item of business at the anti-imperialist conference in Brussels. The Congress voted unanimously to provide, quote, concrete support for the Chinese Revolution. And then following Chiang Kai-shek's massacre of communists in Shanghai in April 1927, so a couple of months after the conference, the KMT was excluded from the Anti-Imperialist League, and the League's attention quickly shifted away from China. But briefly, it was at the very heart of anti-imperialism. So let me now return to Richard Wilhelm in closing. Wilhelm's anti-imperialism became even more pronounced and intense during the 1920s. He wrote in his journal Sinica in 1928 that China's overall aim was to, quote, struggle for its freedom against the foreign powers. He traced China's problems to what he called, quote, barbarian European violence. And he concluded his most famous book, Die Seele Chinas, The Soul of China, with a passage denouncing imperialism forcefully. Here he writes, quote, the West came to China in a particularly unsympathetic form, with sheer violence and exploitation. The old European states were unwilling to accept the new China as a full member of their cultural community. The reason for this was the imperialist principle of force, end quote. Foreshadowing theories of the development of underdevelopment, which took great progress in the 1960s, these theories of underdevelopment, Wilhelm argued that China's impoverishment was, quote, a direct consequence of European action. He concluded that, quote, the West simply does not want China to develop. Man will China sich nicht entwickeln lassen. Wilhelm saw China as a distinct Kulturkreis, and he uses that term from the historicist ethnology of the period in Germany, a cultural circle with spiritual qualities that are preferable in many respects, in his view, to Europeans' more technical, mechanical culture. This might lead us to misunderstand Wilhelm as a member of the conservative revolution, along with figures like Spengler. But I think this would be a big mistake. Although Wilhelm was not active in the Anti-Imperialist League, and he was not active in any political party, certainly not in the Communist Party, he actively supported the Chinese National Revolutionary and anti-imperialist movements in the 1920s, and this aligned him unambiguously with the political left. Wilhelm's efforts at cultural preservation and cultural syncretism carry a cautionary message for us, I think, today. Nowadays, monuments are often destroyed. Canonical texts are sometimes deleted rather than being carefully analyzed and explained and contextualized and reworked, as was already discussed this morning. Cultural essentialism and identitarian politics sometimes seem at odds with cosmopolitanism. Wilhelm's thinking was definitely cosmopolitan, and his thinking foreshadowed post-colonial theory and practice, something we've also heard today, in several ways. He supported open-ended dialogic cultural encounters and rejected all European claims to superiority. And finally, his calls for an open-ended synthesis of world cultures pointed beyond national states and beyond nationalism and beyond empires altogether. Thank you.